My dear sir, Mr. E.H. Harriman, a wealthy New Yorker, is going to Alaska. He desires to take a dozen or so scientific men as his guests. Mr. Harriman requests me to ask you to join the expedition, and I earnestly trust you will do so. The opportunity is one in a lifetime. Very truly yours, C. Hart Mary.
A question I will ask gently. How many American people today remember Edward Herriman? Not so many. What was Herriman? A great industrialist. What's his place in history? Well, I'm not so sure. Maybe Herriman, the industrialist's greatest place in history, is that he brought the naturalists to Alaska.
The Harriman boys never, ever would have been able to reconcile where we are today. I don't think in their wildest imagination anyone in America in 1900 could have conceived of Alaska in 2000.
The original Harriman Alaska Expedition took place in 1899.
The Harriman Alaska Expedition was a strange episode in American science.
It's an amazing group of people who were on that boat.
They wanted to categorize everything, they wanted to catalog everything, they wanted to write it down, they wanted to preserve it.
There was a botanist on board or a bird person, and that individual was expected to capture the biological diversity of this massive expanse of coast.
The Harriman Alaska Expedition Retraced took place 102 years later.
Whose jurisdiction is this?
Chugach National Forest.
Well, there's a big difference between now and 100 years ago, isn't it? 100 years ago, they could do what they wanted.
The original trip was the brainchild of Edward Henry Harriman.
That's where the story starts. It's a man named Edward Henry Harriman, who was the chairman of the board for the Union Pacific Railroad.
He had no background in science. He had an insatiable curiosity about almost everything.
The retracing was the brainchild of Tom Litwin of Clark Science Center, Smith College.
Are there limits on how many can land here? Yes. There are. So it's 20, no matter where we are in here, it's 25 at a time. Right. Okay.
Both expeditions followed the same route.
They went along the entire coast of Alaska.
Ketchikan,
Cape Fox, Glacier Bay,
Sitka,
Latusia Island,
the Yakutat,
The Orca Cannery,
Prince William Sound, Kodiak,
Kukak Bay, south end of Unga Island,
Dutch Harbor,
the Bering Sea,
Boguslav, and the Pribilofs,
St. Paul,
Little Damie, Gamble.
a small Chukchi village called Yanarkanot.
Edward Harriman's purpose is still debated today. Perhaps he came for bear. Harriman the sportsman very much wanted to shoot one. Perhaps it was for minerals, fur, or fish. Harriman the businessman knew that fortunes could be made in Alaska. Or perhaps it was simply love. Love of nature. For Edward Harriman knew that in the making of fortunes, wilderness can often be destroyed.
Alaska itself was in a very fragile state then. It was one of the last great pristine wildernesses in North America, but it had also recently been penetrated by the canning industry, the mining industry, the gold rush. It was on the verge of losing that wilderness that most people associated with it.
The purpose of the Harriman Expedition Retraced was to understand change, to witness the differences that a century has made in Alaska.
We're seeing this landscape at two moments in time. We're seeing it through the eyes of that earlier expedition in 1899, And we're seeing it now at the beginning of the 21st century. And we're asking, what's the shift? What's the change?
Harriman was coming to take a look, to value, to test the opportunity. And Harriman was sort of the ultimate tourist. It's sort of the ultimate adventure. Let's go take a look. But let's do it with some dignity. Let's do it with some professionalism. Let's get the best. Let's get the best.
Harriman started with the best. C. Hart Merriam, first chief of the U.S. Biological Survey. Merriam jumped at the chance to go. He even agreed to recruit the others, selecting a veritable who's who of American science and art. His first pick was John Burroughs, the best-loved nature writer in America.
John Burroughs. Dr. Dahl was our Alaska specialist, having previously visited the territory 13 times. In John Muir, we had an authority on glaciers, and a thorough one, so thorough that he would not allow the rest of the party to have an opinion on the subject. Dr. Furnau was our professor of forestry, then what Professors Emerson, Palash, and Gilbert could not tell us about geology, or Brewer and Gannett about geography, or Merriam about the mammals, or Ridgway, Fisher, or Elliott about birds, or Devereux about mines, or Grinnell and Dellenbaugh about Indians, it could hardly be worth our while to try to find out.
You've got two scientists here, a social scientist and a physical scientist. You've got a native from the area, and we're talking about a phenomenon that's in the headlines today.
The modern expedition traveled on the cruise ship, the Clipper Odyssey. Once again, the ship carried a distinguished team of scientists, writers, and artists. But this time, the experts included women and Alaska natives.
What's your read on...
Harriman's ship, the George W. Elder, steamed out of Seattle on May 31st, 1899.
Hard to stop it there.
The Clipper Odyssey left British Columbia on July 22nd, 2001.
The Clipper Odyssey has thrown off its line. The 1899 Harriman Alaska Expedition Retraced is underway.
Neither expedition was a bare-bones operation.
This trip, we have 118 passengers, traveling with a crew of 72.
Our party, 126 persons in all, included 14 Harriman family members and servants, 2 taxidermists, 2 stenographers, 11 hunters and packers.
Officers, engineers, deckhands, 10 housekeepers, 4 gentlemen serving 2 bars.
2 physicians, 1 trained nurse, 1 doctor of divinity.
This expedition traveled with GPS and with satellite phones and with cell phones and with GPS mapping.
Harriman, too, brought the latest in technology.
He had an enormous graphophone he had hauled on board in Seattle. It had a 6-foot speaker.
Asambuco. Does everybody know what Asambuco is? Yes?
They take along cattle for food. They take along chickens. There's a milk cow to provide milk. There are cases of champagne, cases of cigars. They could enjoy an almost luxurious life.
Harriman was, in 1899, familiar with luxury, but this had not always been the case. Born in New Jersey in 1848, he left school at age 14 to become a Wall Street errand boy. At 22, he was a full-fledged member of the New York Stock Exchange. At 31, he married into a railroad family. 2 years later, he bought his first rail line, 34 miles of track in upstate New York. At 50, he seized control of the vast but ailing Union Pacific Railroad and spent months inspecting every mile, station, flat car, and engine on the line. Harriman got his railroad running smoothly, but in the process, exhausted himself. When his doctor told him to rest, Harriman decided to vacation in the wilds of Alaska, the last American frontier.
Alaska has been somewhat like a colony ever since white people started coming here. There has been wave of exploitation after wave of exploitation, from whales and sea otters to timber and fishing, and of course now oil is the big one, followed close after by industrial tourism. And so what Alaskans have seen is this constant process of outsiders coming, making money, and leaving, and often leaving the place much worse than how it was when they came.
The first leg of the 1899 expedition was along the Inside Passage, an island-studded coastal sea lane stretching from British Columbia to the Gulf of Alaska. Here the expedition discovered gold, the gold rush, now 3 years old.
John Burroughs. Thousands of men had gone into the region on the wildest, vaguest rumor of gold. Alaska is full of such adventurers ransacking the land, men hoping for new Klondikes, hoping to be the first in new and rich fields.
40,000 people go into the Klondike region for the gold rush, but only 400 of those people find gold in quantities that you could go back later and say, well, they made their fortune. That's 1%. It's only the people like Herriman who can make opportunity actually come to exist in Alaska, because it's going to take huge amounts of money, and they're the people with the huge amounts of money.
At the mining town of Skagway, Harriman took his scientists for a ride on the White Pass Railroad, one of Alaska's first rail lines built to carry miners into the gold fields.
Although there's no real clear evidence that he was here to scout out investments in mining or in a railroad, it's real hard to believe that railroads weren't on his mind. People had immense difficulty getting into that remote corner of Alaska, and if only one could provide transportation into the interior, think of the wealth that could be reaped from that landscape.
When Harriman saw the railroads across the White Pass or the gold mines, he saw the country live with possibilities, but also with forebodings. When he saw the horrendous blighted landscape caused by the mining, there's no doubt that he saw the duality of this, that progress carried this awful price of destroying the landscape in the process.
On board the Elder were two men deeply committed to protecting the landscape. One was John Muir, the founder of the Sierra Club. He was, at 59, a passionate evangelist for the cause of wilderness. He had spent months and even years on his own in wild places. This was his 8th trip to Alaska. The other was John Burroughs, the best-known nature writer of his day. The comfort-loving Burroughs lived in New York's bucolic Catskill region and had never traveled west of the Mississippi. But if he did not travel, his writing did. He had sold over 2 million copies of his 27 books.
Their personalities could not have been more different. Burroughs was quiet, reclusive, introspective. He called himself the dreamer aboard the ship. Muir was outgoing, aggressive.
He was probably the most reluctant guest that Edward Harriman had. He was suspicious of a millionaire railroad tycoon.
Harriman, after all, represented the class of business that Muir, as head of the Sierra Club, regarded as a threat to the wilderness.
He agreed to go only because he would see parts of Alaska that he had never seen before, and probably at that point in his life thought this was the last time to get to see them.
John Burroughs. June 8, 1899, finds us in Glacier Bay on our way to the Muir Glacier. We were in the midst of strange scenes, hard to render in words. The miles upon miles of moraines on either hand, gray, loosely piled, from 50 to 200 feet high. Sparkling seawater dotted with blue bergs and loose drift ice. Nothing we had read or heard prepared us for the color of the ice, especially the newly exposed parts. Its deep, almost indigo blue.
Glacier Bay was the first truly wild stop on the voyage. For 5 days, the company happily explored the landscape, shooting and trapping animal specimens, mapping waterways, measuring the glaciers that almost surrounded the bay.
In the time of Harriman, we knew about glacier ice, we knew how it formed and how it flowed, how it made the kind of landscapes that we see here, how it carves the mountains. Most of these glaciers are in what is called catastrophic retreat, which means that they are retreating very rapidly.
John Muir was an authority on glaciers. Glacier Bay was his old playland and homestead. He had lived for months by the massive river of ice now called the Muir Glacier. In 1899, he was amazed to discover that it had receded by a full 2 miles in just 20 years. Today, scientists know that the entire width of Glacier Bay was once covered by ice, a glacier that has retreated 70 miles in 150 years.
What could be more dramatic over a 150-year period than this? And I don't think any of the global warming predictions come close to this kind of global environmental change in such a short period of time.
Whatever we're contributing to global warming, and I'm sure that's significant, it's sitting on top of this larger trend.
Global warming is a long, steady process that's been going on at rather a rapid rate for quite some time now, ever since the Industrial Revolution, in fact. And we can actually track it by looking at the carbon dioxide content of the atmosphere and correlate this with warming.
There's certainly some effect that humans have had to help produce this warming, but there are probably other natural, normal climate cycles that are operating at the same time. So I think the question for modern scientists today is whether the human impact is the whole story or if the human impact is only part of the story.
One of the things I love about the mountains, just love, is the way the mists weave in and out, and they create these little scenes that only last for an instant and then they're gone. The cloud, it just floats along.
It's hard to know whether it was Harriman's idea or Merriam's idea to include artists and poets and writers on this trip. Perhaps a little bit of both. But it was a stroke of genius because it made this trip something different. It took it that next step above a strict scientific exploring expedition.
Frederick Dellenbaugh and R. Swain Gifford, the artists who accompanied the original Harriman Expedition, did work that's documentary. Their work is very observational. Prior to the invention of photography, and especially to the invention of cameras that could be easily used on expeditions of this sort, the role of the artist was really to document, to record, and to be as dispassionate a recorder as possible. What I'm hoping to do is something that's more reflective of the beginning of the 21st century than the end of the 19th century.
In 1899, there was also a photographer aboard the Elder. He was there largely by coincidence.
The year before the Harriman Expedition, George Bird Grinnell and Seahart Merriam were hiking together on Mount Rainier in Washington, and they became totally lost. By sheer chance, a young photographer found them and helped them home. This was Edward Curtis.
The chance meeting would shape Curtis's career and alter the future of American photography. When Merriam needed a photographer to take to Alaska, he remembered the young Curtis and asked him to come.
Curtis had been given a specific assignment, which was to document the geology and geography of the area. So we have wonderful photographs of the landscapes that they passed.
But Curtis's budding career was very nearly cut short in Glacier Bay. Expedition members left the ship in small boats to get a better look at their surroundings, as they would often do throughout the trip. In Glacier Bay, these outings were far riskier than they realized.
It's quite dangerous to approach the face of the glaciers without knowing the potential hazard. When you first come in here, up to the face of a glacier, it might be quiet, but there's a lot of icebergs around. And the face of these glaciers can be up to 300 feet tall, the calving face where it's actually breaking off. And on a normal day, pieces of ice falling off the size of most people's homes, sometimes the size of very large buildings.
As Edward Curtis and his assistant sat in a canoe near Muir Glacier, the face of the ice suddenly cracked and crumbled. The rest of the expedition watched in horror as a massive iceberg crashed into the water. A wave 30 feet high swept toward the tiny canoe.
I thought they were doomed as the great wave bore down upon them. The wave rolled on like a mighty earthquake, sweeping dozens of smaller bergs before it. But both men are splendid canoemen. And as the wave came, they paddled bravely right into its face and, to my amazement, rose up over it. As successive waves came, they were met in the same way. Finally, the boys got ashore with their canoe. The sight was one never to be forgotten. Seahart Merriam.
John Burroughs. We lingered in Glacier Bay and in adjacent waters 5 or 6 days, sending out botanical, zoological, and glacial expeditions in various directions. Yes, and one hunting party to stir up the bears in Howling Valley.
John Muir told Edward Harriman about a valley some miles away, so full of big game that it was called Howling Valley, though maps titled it simply Endicott. Muir neglected to mention that his own journey there had nearly cost him his life, and Harriman, eager to bag an Alaskan brown bear, set right off.
It was almost impossible to get to. They had to hike 24 miles across the treacherous edge of a glacier through very thick snow and very foul weather. And when they got about 16 miles into the trip, their guide, a man who had once scouted for George Custer, said, "That's enough for me, I'm going back to the boat." Harriman trudged on, and it was so tough they had to rope themselves together to keep up in the deep snow. They finally made it to the valley. No animals. And all they could do was turn around and trudge the 24 miles back through the storm and come home empty-handed.
Frederick Dellenbaugh. Dr. Merriam got rheumatism in his knees and came back pretty well crippled. Herriman looked used up, but seemed to stand it well or better than any of them.
There might not be any bears in Howling Valley after all, Burroughs wrote. Muir's imagination may have done all the howling.
June 14th, 1899. We came into Sitka's island-studded and mountain-locked harbor under dripping skies.
Sitka's one of the most beautiful places anywhere in North America. I know very few places that are as beautiful. And yet it is also a human community that has been on that site for centuries now, that has very rich culture, Russian heritage, Scandinavian heritage, Tlingit heritage.
My name is Shot Lane, which means Big Mountain or Mount Fairweather. I am a raven of the Sockeye House, Ducktake-Ton clan. If I was living here back in 1899 and Mr. Harriman came in with a big yacht, he'd probably impress the heck out of me. I'd look at that yacht and say, "Oh boy, a white man lives pretty good. I want some of that." I probably would.
When Harriman was here 100 years ago, Native people were living off the land. But there were these two forces wanting to assimilate Native people. Native people entering the cash economy, and also the repression of Native culture and languages by Western forces, teachers and missionaries.
When the European people first came here, they immediately assumed we were savages, heathen savages, pagans. No one asked us about our religion. We were a very spiritual people, and we were always taught to respect another man's religion and his right to communicate with his creator. But no one asked us that.
What the government wanted to do, what the missionaries wanted to do, what compassionate Americans wanted to do was to assimilate those people, to acculturate them to American values so that they could survive. And I think that the Harriman Expedition, virtually to a person, saw the native population in that way.
In Sitka, Harriman hauled ashore his enormous graphophone. He used this primitive tape recorder to record a group of Tlingit men and preserved a sample of a language that seemed about to disappear, since Tlingits were required to speak English in church, in school, and at work.
Certainly when Harriman came through, that was a tough time to be a native 100 years ago. Today, it's a lot better, and at least part of the reason it's better is because we have an economic foothold because of native corporations and because of our participation in the political and economic future of this country.
Edward Harriman, and in fact almost all Americans of his day, would be surprised by the reversal of fortunes that has taken place over the last century. For the status of Native peoples in Alaska is quite different than it is in the lower 48.
The United States Congress halted treaty making with Native Americans right after the Civil War. In other words, right at the time of the Alaska Purchase. So there were no treaties with Alaska Natives. The practical effect of that was that there weren't any Indian reservations in Alaska.
Since they were not restricted to reservations, Alaska Natives continued to live on the land and claim it as their own. In the 1960s, when oil companies drew up plans for a pipeline across Alaska, the Natives asserted their rights to the land.
They went to Congress. They rejected going through the Court of Claims because they wanted to have land. They didn't want to have just money. We wanted control of land.
In 1971, Congress passed the Alaska Native Claims Settlement Act, ANCSA, which turned over 44 million acres and nearly $1 billion to Alaska's natives. A network of native corporations was established to administer the money and oversee the land.
Alaska Natives are in a position to sit down and say, okay, here are the areas that we traditionally utilized and we want title to these areas, and they get title to those areas.
For the Harriman Expedition, the native people were never the main focus. The scientists had come to study glaciers and mountains, flora and fauna. In Sitka, what was most striking to them was the obvious. They could see the trees. For much of the forests of the continental United States had already been logged to devastation. But the expedition's chief expert on trees, surprisingly, did not see Alaska's trees as a gold mine.
A somber mixed forest of hemlock and spruce skirts the Alaskan shore westward. The even-tempered, moist climate accounts for the luxuriant forest cover of conifers. Luxuriance is a relative term here, since the larger portion of the area does not contain trees fit for lumber. Bernhard Fernau.
Bernhard Fernau was the Elder's resident forester. An elegant Prussian with musical talents, he was also chair of the ship's entertainment committee.
Bernhard Fernau played the piano on the original expedition, and so I'm going to try to emulate this and play a few pieces.
In addition to the small value of these woods, the conditions under which lumbering would have to be carried out and the distance from markets means this forest will be left untouched.
Fernau is talking at the turn of the century about practices when everybody expected to harvest large, clear logs and didn't expect that any lumber would have knots in it.
What he saw was a very complex forest. He saw it was very patchy, very uneven, was concerned about what is the wood quality, how can you make money off of logging that forest.
Bernhard Fernau's prediction that the Alaskan forest would not be logged actually proved correct, all the way until 1947, when the federal government began to subsidize pulp mills. Thousands of acres in the Tongass National Forest in southeast Alaska were cut, and the wood sold at dirt-cheap prices. Many Alaskans welcomed the jobs, but to others, the clear cutting was an outrage.
Okay, I'm Officer David Camp of the Sitka Police Department. I'm notifying you that you're required by law to leave at this time. Do you understand that?
There came about a very, very deep and destructive conflict in southeast Alaska between people who said, we don't want our forest treated this way, and people who said, whatever we have to do to have jobs is okay.
You can't leave because you're chained here. How did you get chained here?
Locked in now.
You chained yourself here?
Two things happened. The economics of pulp mills didn't pan out. They were losing money, and people in southeast Alaska and all over the country said, we will not countenance what's being done to the forest in order to sustain these industries.
This forest has been continuously a forest for hundreds of years, basically. You can see that large hemlock in the background here. That tree is, I'm sure, at least 250 to 300 years old, and that grew under the canopy in old forest. And beside it, you can see trees of many different sizes and shape, and you can see layer upon layer upon layer of leaves. Now let's look at this forest over here. You see, what we've got is this is a forest that was clear-cut approximately 50 years ago. They're about the same size here, and really there's only one layer of canopy above us, so it's a very simple forest. It's so difficult for plants to grow under this forest. It is strictly a timber forest. The decision to clear cut for us is a very long-term one.
By the 1990s, the pulp mills had closed their doors, but clear cutting still continues in southeast Alaska.
When I fly over Hoona, I normally will take a book and read because I can't stand to look out the window and see it. I mean, for miles and miles and miles in every direction is nothing but clear cut. The Hoona Indian Association, for the past 10 years, has spoken out against any clear cut logging in the region. The unfortunate part of it is that it's our own corporations who are doing the logging.
On native titled land, which is private land, the natives are free to do anything they want to with the land. And one of the ways that they have attempted to generate profit for the corporation is to clear cut the trees and ship them wherever there's a market.
Now, I don't have anything against logging. Don't get me wrong. I've lived around logging all my life. Little Jippo outfits in Port Frederick here. It'd take them 10 years to log 2 acres, you know. I mean, it wasn't noticeable. And it supplied jobs for people that wanted to work in the woods. We got along fine with the loggers. But what you see here is mass destruction. This is disrespect. This is against culture and, on the long run, the economy.
What we're trying to do is address a lot of objectives. Some people believe that we should just preserve the forest. Natives should not harvest or extract resources. But we have a responsibility to advance, again, the social, cultural, economic welfare of our shareholders.
We can submit resolution after resolution, stage protest after protest, and we have no recourse. We've been able to slow the harvesting volume down with the U.S. Forest Service because we have a process. We can take it through the court systems. With our own corporations, we have no recourse. They say they need to provide this income for all of the shareholders.
One could believe that all of the things about ANCSA are tearing Native people apart. The notion of corporations having nothing to do with cultural values and who we are as Native people. But if you look at ANCSA a little more deeply, I think, it also gives you hope and maybe even some inspiration, because ANCSA corporations own the land subject to congressional act in fee simple. We could sell the land at any time. And several of the corporations have gone through bankruptcy. And never in any of that did ANCSA corporations sell land, because to do so would be to give up their connection to what makes them native.
What we have in Sitka is a classic confrontation of a sort of an old established American way of looking at the world, which is the forest is here for the harvesting. And a newer point of view which says that the natural world is valuable for other reasons than just tearing trees off the mountainsides.
There's a troubling issue. The United States is far and away the largest consumer of wood products. And where is that wood going to come from?
Almost all of our red cedar goes into the United States market. It's used as house siding, fence posts.
As we protected our forests in the United States, we increased our import of timber products from Canada, which has lower environmental standards. And I'm working in South America, and there's a lot of concern there. Areas like the Tongass, if there's no timber program, will simply put pressure on areas that are actually in many ways much more fragile than the Tongass. So it's a really complicated issue. I don't see a simple answer here.
Sitka is said to be one of the rainiest spots on the coast. People actually live in Sitka from choice and seem to find life sweet.
This is a very valuable way of living. Hunting, fishing, enjoying the beauty of the land. A lot of your city folks want to get out of the city, and they're moving up to Washington. They're spreading further north all the time so they could live our lifestyle. Let's protect what we have left.
After 4 warm, humid days at Sitka, we turned our faces for the first time toward the open ocean. The usual Alaska excursion ends at Sitka, but ours was now only fairly begun.
Okay, hang on. Oh, here's a good thing. Here's 2 sea otters. 2 sea otters right in here. You can pickle this kelp, and this is the flotation device. What we eat, pickle is the just this part. You can also slice them and fry them in a frying pan. What the songbirds are up there. I ate a cormorant one time. The old Aleuts and Alutiiq people here ate cormorants, and it had the consistency of a rubber tire, kind of. It was very, very tough. There's a little chitin here. You see the little chitin? Those are edible too. I'm more likely to know about it if you can eat it.
John Burroughs, June 24th, 1899. In the early evening, we sighted a little cluster of buildings peeping out of the forest at the base of a lofty mountain. This was Orca, where there is a large salmon cannery.
The Harriman Expedition was right here in 1899. The Orca cannery was right here. And this was a place where Grinnell observed cannery operations.
George Bird Grinnell was a distinguished writer and editor, an expert in Native American ways of life, and an ardent conservationist. At Orca, Grinnell was shocked and very angry.
The cannery managers run their factories in the most wasteful and thoughtlessly selfish way, grasping eagerly for everything that is within their reach and thinking nothing of the future. Their motto seems to be, if I don't take all I can get, somebody else will. George Bird Grinnell.
For all the talk about gold rushes and other booms and busts, canned salmon was by and large one of the main drivers of Alaska's economy.
The fishing activity that was going on here was so cutthroat, both in competition among the canneries and so rapacious, that he feared that the salmon would go the way, as he put it, of the buffalo in the lower 48.
In 1899, when Herriman brought his expedition up to Alaska, there was very little in the way of government oversight. The Treasury Department is in charge of regulating fisheries. They saw it solely as commerce. They really didn't have an idea as to what was happening biologically with the salmon.
Salmon have a very interesting life history, and the important part of the life history is that they come back to a river to spawn. All the salmon in a particular river come up by the cannery. They all come by the same place, so it's easy to take them all. Now, if you take all the fish, you won't notice that for a few years because there's still adults out to sea that are waiting to come in. But if you do that for 2 or 3 years in a row, there won't be any fish left in that river. At Harriman's day, there were only enough canneries to have local effects.
Right after the Harriman Expedition, the canning industry doubles by 1901, and by 1903 it has doubled in size again. There are canneries springing up everywhere. The number of fish that had been caught and canned continued to grow and grow and grow. It actually wasn't until 1919 that the first serious signs of depletion were apparent, and it caused a panic in the industry. One of the striking features of the Alaska fisheries is the extraordinary boom and bust nature of these economies. In the case of fisheries, you see different waves of fish being exploited at different moments, very intensive exploitation, and then the collapse of the population on which the fisheries depended.
The canneries were able to severely deplete the salmon all over Alaska, so salmon became very scarce. The Secretary of the Interior was coming up here, and the President was worried about this place. The people who lived here wanted to manage their own resources and stop the rapacious overexploitation of the resources that was occurring because the canneries were based in Seattle and San Francisco and not here.
Finally, in 1959, the salmon found an unlikely savior: statehood. When Alaska became a state, it was able to set fishing limits for itself.
The salmon became much more abundant again. And when you look down there you see salmon swimming around in the water. This is typical of so much of Alaska today. You can still see teeming salmon runs in many of the rivers.
Today's runs are largely very healthy, but we do see some weakness. The desperately weak runs in the Yukon and Kuskokwim rivers this year are a tremendous cause of concern. And it cries out for many of the things that Grinnell was saying back in 1899. We need more scientific inquiry, we need to know what's going on with these fish, and we need stronger regulation and enforcement of fishing rules.
June 25th, 1899. Prince William Sound is shaped like a spider, an open, irregular body of water 80 miles or more across. We are in a great ice chest. The mountains are ribbed with glaciers, and the head of the bay is walled with them. John Burroughs.
It was in Prince William Sound that the expedition made the most important discovery of the entire voyage. The Elder steamed up to an enormous glacier on the western side of the Sound, and this was as far as they could go, according to the maps. But John Muir spotted a narrow gap between the ice wall and the rocky coastline. He asked Harriman to let him take a small boat to explore the opening, but Edward Harriman had another idea. He ordered the captain and the pilot to steer the Elder itself right into the passage.
The local pilot refused to do it. Matter of fact, he stomped off to his room because he saw the potential hazards, which any prudent mariner would see. Is it deep enough to take a big ship through there? Can they have any control over the ship with the current the way it is? Were they going to get smashed into the glacier? Would they ever get out of there again?
In this critical moment, Harriman had to decide whether to say, well, there might be something, there might not. What Harriman did was not only decide that, yes, we're going to go further, but he took over the helm so that he would be responsible rather than the captain.
Which to me doesn't make sense, because what good would financial responsibility do if you're going to lose the whole ship anyways and you're all going to die? They were headed perilously towards the face of the glacier, no control whatsoever, but the current was so strong and it was running parallel to the face of the glacier that the current kept them away from the ice.
The Elder hugged the rocky shoreline and threaded its way through the channel.
John Muir. The passage was dangerously narrow and threatening, but gradually opened into a magnificent icy fjord about 12 miles long. Mr. Harriman ordered the captain to proceed up the middle of the new fjord. "Full speed, sir?" inquired the captain. "Yes, full speed ahead."
Muir was right, his theory was correct. They discovered a whole new embayment that had never been studied before. I'm a little baffled by how they made it across it, because it's not really an easy place to navigate through today.
I've thought a great deal about how lucky the first expedition was. They did take a dangerous route. They were in uncharted waters, literally, in many places. They did not know what to expect. I think that turn towards the Harriman Fjord and the glacier which they found really did show tremendous bravery.
I saw that Mr. Harriman was uncommon. He was taking a trip for rest and at the same time managing his exploring guests as if he were a grateful, soothing, essential part of his rest cure. Those scientific explorers are not easily managed. Nevertheless, he kept us all in smooth working order, looking after everything to the minutest details. John Muir.
John Muir and John Burroughs, both of them had a dark suspicion of businessmen and their motives. That suspicion really lasted until they got aboard ship and met Herriman, and gradually their suspicions thawed.
I think there's a deeper connection between Muir and Herriman. As different as those two men were, it takes a great deal of vision and dedication to do what Edward Herriman did, obviously, in a world of J. Pierpont Morgan and Rockefeller and Carnegie. But with John Muir, it took a great deal of dedication and commitment to spend the months and months of solitude that he spent in the wilderness. I think that they recognized something of themselves in each other, and they began a lifelong friendship.
Muir and the others promptly named the new body of water the Harriman Fjord, and the glacier at its far end was called the Harriman Glacier.
sir.
Thank you again.
Midship.
Midship.
Chris, what's your read on Prince William Sound?
Cox is still down on the water. You might see a little bit of calving there, but the most active one and the biggest one here is Barry. I mean, how good is this boat in ice? Can we go?
There's no ice classification, so we can't go into ice. We can navigate around ice.
The Harriman Expedition, Prince William Sound was a world of pristine glacial wonders. To the American public almost a century later, it would become famous as the site of something quite different, the Exxon Valdez oil spill.
Prince William Sound was the site of the 1989 oil spill. Just really over in that area next to Bly Island is, you can't see it, Bly Reef. And that's where the oil tanker ran aground in March of 1989. For 3 days, people couldn't figure out what to do. There was very little response equipment around. There was no effort to clean it up because the equipment wasn't there. People were not prepared for something like this. And then a big storm came in and moved the oil out. It hit Kodiak Island, Afognak Island. The currents took it up into Cook Inlet. Over 1,000 miles of shoreline were oiled.
It was the largest spill in North American history. 11 million gallons of oil leaked from the ship.
Everybody was clamoring for Exxon to do something. And so Exxon did probably about the worst thing it could have done. They went on the beaches with high-pressure hot water hoses and squirted soapy water on the rocks. So the oil seeped down deep into the rocks, deep into the substrate.
The oil spill was a terrible disaster, and particularly for the people who used resources for their daily food. You can imagine somebody showing up and throwing a bucket of crude oil into your refrigerator. Well, this is just what happened to the people in Prince William Sound.
We saw in the newspaper that the oil was a few miles out off Cape Ialik where we fished, and we got in the boat and immediately headed on out there. And it was kind of overwhelming to smell it in the air, to see the seabirds and everything dying.
Thousands of birds were killed, sea otters, harbor seals, fish. There were immediate effects like that. Probably the most devastating effects, though, were the long-term effects. We have a crew out this summer that is looking at all of the beaches that were heavily and moderately oiled in 1989. They're finding 10 times more oil than they anticipated. There's oil that's a lot lower on the tide line, and it's just being leached out very slowly over time. It's still fresh oil, it's still toxic. The connection between oil as a resource extractive industry and the kinds of industries that were going on in the Herriman days is very similar. In those days, they were overfishing salmon, they were overfishing herring. It was that classic, come to Alaska, let's dig it up, let's catch it, and then let's move on.
Since the 1970s, oil has flowed from mile marker 0 in Prudhoe Bay on the Arctic Ocean to mile marker 800 at Valdez in Prince William Sound.
It's amazing that those engineers had so much hubris that they believed that they could build an 800-mile-long pipeline, pump oil into it at Prudhoe Bay and get it out at Valdez 800 miles below. And not only did they have that hubris, they were right, they did it. It is an amazing thing that it's changed the face of Alaska in many, many ways.
The oil companies pay royalties to the state. The money is invested for the citizens of Alaska in an account called the Permanent Fund.
The Permanent Fund dividend was money that was set aside back when the oil windfalls were created. It provides every Alaskan with a dividend check, and I think this year they're talking about it being close to $2,000 per person for every man, woman, and child. If you're a family of 4, you stand to get $8,000 in the mail. That, for a lot of Alaskans, it's a tremendous supplement for their income. This money that I don't think anybody in their wildest imagination thought would amount more to a couple $100, a little bonus for people when the program was first started. It now has a tremendous impact on the state economy.
Yes, oil has been good to Alaska. Yes, we have great schools in Anchorage, and we can build airports, and we can do all these great things for the state. But it has this price tag to it.
You also have to ask where this oil goes. It goes to Washington State, it goes to Southern California, and it fuels the automobiles and other energy needs of the Los Angeles Basin. It wouldn't be here if the Los Angeles Basin weren't needing this oil. We're all tied up in this place. It's not just Alaskans.
For Exxon Oil, the price tag came to $900 million in the form of a fund that pays for habitat protection and environmental research in Prince William Sound.
The transport of petroleum is the reason this study's being funded. We had an accident here 10 years ago, and this study's a direct result of a human accident that impacted the environment, and our studies out here are directed at determining how that spill affected these animals.
This is very different than the Harriman Expedition.
Jennifer's doing heart rate, watching how diving ability develops in these pups. We're putting a satellite tag on one tonight, and we'll monitor its movements and its diving behavior for the next 10 months. We take a biopsy from each of these animals, and your grandmother was right. You are what you eat. You can actually tell what the older seals have been eating based on the fatty acid signature in their blubber layer.
The good that came out of the oil spill was in the form of moving science forward. We have had so much research devoted to understanding birds, shellfish, mammals in Prince William Sound that wouldn't have otherwise been spent.
Well, I've seen the oil spill, and after that I've seen a slow increase of use. I guess you'd call it a people spill. And a lot of us think it's going to be far worse than any oil spill ever will be.
Straight ahead is College Fjord, and aboard this new vessel we can get closer than ever before.
That breakwater was originally built around 1985.
When you board today, you need to be thinking if you would like chicken cordon bleu or halibut.
And taking a look at the cruise ship schedule for today, a busy day on the docks. The Crown Princess is here already, tied up at 6:30 this morning.
Tourism was in its infancy when Harriman arrived. Today, it is one of the state's leading industries.
And the Sky Princess is scheduled to be here at right around 1 and to leave at 6 p.m. for a grand total of 6,377 passengers visiting our tiny little town today.
It has imposed on Alaska the obligation on one hand to be oil barrel for the nation and national park for the world, and to meet both of those roles sufficiently or adequately is an extremely difficult balancing act. Tourism is to a degree a benign industry, but it does have its impacts.
100 years ago, tourist boats had started, and they stayed more or less at the place and they went for a couple of hikes. But now there's transportation systems. They've got helicopters going off. There's multiple landing pads down there. They've got little airplanes for flight seeing. The crowding impact can extend way over the hills into the desirable wilderness.
Most visitors see Alaska from the deck of a cruise ship. These vessels are like small cities carrying thousands of people. A typical day on a ship bearing 1,800 passengers involves over 7,000 meals, 2,000 showers, and several tons of laundry.
One of the interesting things about the cruise industry is that there's a whole hidden area that nobody thinks about. That's the crew of the ships. One of the things that you find in every port is discussions about the telephones. Where are they? What they're looking for is services for when they're in port, and that's really important to them to communicate back home. Come around the corner. 19. So there's 20 stations, 20 internet stations. What kinds of things are purchased here? I assume it's mostly crew, is it?
Yeah, it's mostly crew, so we've got a lot of different snacks from different countries, from Philippines, Indonesia, Great Britain.
Boy, you're catering to it all. Thanks. It says it all, doesn't it? Cruise ship services.
Cruise ships have brought the marvels of Alaska to millions of people, and air and water pollution to the Alaskan coast. The state legislature has passed the tightest controls on cruise ship pollution in the nation, but the flood of visitors is still rising.
My fear is that pristine wilderness environments like Prince William Sound will be overexploited. There'll be lodges coming in, there'll be more and more tour boats, there'll be more and more kayak operators, there'll be more and more operators like myself. It's going to take away from that wilderness quality, that feeling that, wow, I'm out here walking where no one's ever walked before.
We should lay up against tourism the same criteria that I would place against every growth proposal, development proposal. Is it environmentally sound? Does it pay its own way? And do the people want it? I think in some areas we're finding a negative reaction on the part of people who say enough already.
There's no limit on the number of airplanes and helicopters that can be flying over glaciers. There's no limit on the number of cruise ships and lodges and buses. People seem to think that there's absolutely, the space here is endless. And a lot of us who came up here looking for something different, seeking something different, are watching Alaska gradually, relentlessly becoming just like every other place in the United States.
I was born and raised in California, and I felt like I should have lived 100 years ago. All I had to do was come here. And I'm like 100 years back. I'm hauling my water. I do have electricity with generators, but this is like it was 100 years ago. It's just I'm here now. I am a oyster farmer, and I live here with my husband. We grow these from little itty-bitty things, and we sell them to restaurants, and we go to the state fair, and we sell them direct to customers. I can take them, and I can open them, and I can serve them chilled with a sauce, and I can see people drop to their knees and say, oh, that was the best I've ever had. And what would that motivate you to do or to be in life? I think I'd be an oyster farmer. Wonderful. Want one? They are good.